trust in a diverse society. The differences across our 41 sites are very substantial in absolute terms. In highly diverse Los Angeles or San Francisco, for example, roughly 30% of the inhabitants say that they trust their neighbors a lot, whereas in the ethnically homogeneous communities of North and South Dakota, 70 to 80% of the inhabitants say the same. In more diverse communities, people trust their neighbors less. Robert D. Putnam, E Pluribus Unum, Diversity and Community in the 21st Century, 2007. As I was scrolling through the internet with the intention to find something interesting to read, I came across an article by this guy Kenan Malik. I have to admit, I don't really know who he is, but this particular article of his raised my attention. It was called Trust in a Diverse Society, a particular interest of mine, so I read it. I read some studies that were presented as sources for his arguments, and while I enjoyed his style of writing, I've got to say, after going through what I at least hoped to be enormous amounts of data, he drew the following conclusion: over the past few decades, we have witnessed the demise of movements for social change, the rise of identity politics, the atomization of society, a loss of belief in universal values, all of which has led to civic disengagement and a greater sense of enemy. The real problem, then, may not be diversity as such but the political context in which we think about it. So, in essence, the problems that rise out of polarization of societies by multiculturalism, read, anti-culturalism, aren't caused by the actions taken, but the cause of those actions. So, diversity isn't a problem, but the problem is the way we look at it? Sure. There must be a warped way to look at the data, a way which makes the ever-rising crime rates look like nice things, a way which would make the possibility of little children being kidnapped from the street on their way to school and sold to a Saudi-led sex ring. Sure, that warped way can exist in this warped day and age, but unfortunately we're looking at the world through different goggles, Mr. Malik. In 2007, a fellow named Robert D. Putnam, an American political scientist, published a study about trust in diverse societies. The study was actually finished in 2001, but as the story goes, he wasn't very happy with the outcome of this research, so in 2001, he only published the data, and after 6 whole years of waiting, he released the whole paper. He has been largely criticized for this delay, and Putnam has been quoted saying that he needed that 6 years to develop proposals to compensate for the negative effects of diversity. I must be honest, that one got a sincere chuckle out of me. This guy apparently rushed to make the study to prove the world that diversity is really a strength, and the results were just devastating. Not that I'm making fun of this guy. This research has really benefited the world, and given us a clearer understanding towards the racial tensions that are ever more present in our current societies. So, he eventually released the paper, and got the expected backlash, like John Leo, the writer and editor-in-chief for Minding the Campus, said, academics aren't supposed to withhold negative data until they can suggest antidotes to their findings. I couldn't agree more. Putnam's study suggests that in diverse areas, the level of trust is generally much lower than that of homogeneous areas. To their surprise and mine, this study showed that not only did people lack trust to other ethnicities living close to them in diverse areas, people also trusted their own race less in those areas, meaning that overall, whenever racial differences are at play, there's low trust in general to the people that live near to you. In the article published by Scientific American, a woman named Daisy Grewell writes the following: sociologists Mario Pascal, of Princeton University, and Delia Baldassari, of New York University, published a paper late last year which refutes Putnam's conclusions. After reanalyzing the same dataset used by Putnam, Pascal and Baldassari asserted that when it comes to distrust and diversity, most of the distrust is expressed by whites who feel uncomfortable living among racial minorities. In other words, greater distrust may stem from prejudice rather than from diversity per se. Therefore, Putnam's conclusion that racial diversity leads to less altruism and cooperation amongst neighbors was incorrect. If there is a downside to diversity, it has less to do with the behavior of racial minorities and more to do with how whites feel when living among non-whites. So, once again, it's not them, it's us. According to this lady, distrust only matters if it has been expressed by non-whites living at the same area with whites. But if the whites are the ones feeling the loss of trust in their neighbors, oh, check your privilege. You're white, so we really couldn't give a damn about your feelings. I mean, look at her statement. It's utter nonsense. Well, it's true that whites seem to trust other races very little when forced to live with them, but hey, distrust is distrust, no matter how you try to twist the results. If it doesn't matter if whites trust their neighbors or not, why would it matter if blacks do? And don't you dare forget about the natives. But of course, when we continue reading this scrap a bit further down, she reveals her true colors. She goes on to say, to understand why Abascal and Baldassare came to such different conclusions than Putnam, one has to start with understanding how researchers have traditionally defined and measured the diversity of a community. Scholars, including Putnam, have measured diversity through a concept called the heterogeneity index, which tells you what proportion of a community is made up of members of different groups. Using the index, a community made up of 80% whites and 20% blacks would be considered equally diverse as one made up of 20% whites and 80% blacks. This is a problematic assumption. You see anything wrong with this? In my mind, a huge noisy alarm goes off every single time I hear someone utter the word problematic. Tell me, Daisy, what makes this assumption of equal diversity in these scenarios so problematic? Could it be that you think that only the blacks are the ones that bring diversity with them, and therefore whites are the ones that take it away? Her bias is so painfully clear I feel dumb even pointing out her errors, but hey, I've gone too far to stop now. If the population is 80% one race, and 20% another race, and this will surely blow your mind, the diversity is exactly 80% and 20%, no matter what those two races are. What if it were blacks and natives? Natives and Jews? Jews and Mexicans? Africans and Somalis? Do the ethnicities matter to the math here? No, of course they don't. But again, this must be just another white leftist chick thinking she's doing such a good job portraying as her own race meant nothing, while other races were exotic, diverse, and beautiful. That's exactly what this is, just utter nonsense. I'd even go as far as to say that her statement here was a bit problematic. You thought this was over? Not even close. She goes on stating that there is a third factor to consider, the authors argue. In the US, heterogeneous communities tend to be undergoing demographic change, either due to white flight or gentrification. Sadly, it's rare to see well-established and stable racially diverse communities. Therefore, it may be the instability of diverse communities, rather than diversity itself, that erodes trust. Greater neighborhood instability has been linked to many other negative outcomes such as more substance abuse, child abuse, infant mortality, and crime. Let's unpack this a little. She's saying that the increasing levels of distrust aren't exactly caused by diversity, but by the instability of diverse areas and neighborhoods. What is causing that instability? Isn't it exactly diversity that causes that instability, more substance abuse, child abuse, infant mortality, and the rising levels of crime? She is, once again, twisting the study to fit her own political and sociological narrative. It's not diversity and immigration that causes distrust in these communities, it's the ever-increasing crime rates. It's like telling someone that they keep feeling nauseous not because they have a lung cancer, but because they are suffering from the effects of lung cancer. Let's just advise her to eat some ginger on a daily basis, and she won't feel so nauseous all the time. It's this one bad doctor who keeps medicating the symptoms, and not the underlying condition that's causing these symptoms. The fact of the matter is that diversity brings problems, as mentioned above by Daisy Grewell, wherever and whenever it increases. It's not like Mexicans start moving into an all-white neighborhood, and the whites that used to live there in relative peace and harmony start suddenly using drugs and abusing children out of distrust to their newly arrived neighbors, is it? It's the newcomers that make the rates of crime grow, and the fact that they just so happened to move into an all-white neighborhood matters little to none. She ends this article by stating, that efforts to celebrate diversity as an ideal will do little to solve the practical challenges of living in an increasingly multicultural society. Instead, we will need to first acknowledge and discuss that for some of us, living alongside people who are different is not as desirable as we might like to think. I couldn't agree more. So what if we wish to remain within our own kind? So what if we want to live in a land completely free of diversity? I'd surely grant that wish to each and every demographic group, from whites to Asian and to blacks. I think this wish to remain free of the stranglehold of multiculturalism is sincere and should be respected. We should have absolute freedom to associate with whoever we wish, as should every single race in this God-forsaken earth. Why is that something to look down upon? Why is that evil? Why is it problematic to you, that in general, whites don't trust other races as much as other races tend to trust whites? One thing, and this isn't proven, at least I don't think it is, but this is just something that came to mind while reading these studies, is that while we look the world history, whites have by far been the most individualistic societies among all the races. Whites have done the best when left to live with their own. Whites have built the world with little to no help from everybody else, so could this be one biological reason why we don't tend to trust the stranger, so to speak? Blacks in America, as well as blacks in Finland, tend to use the welfare system much more, and in fact, are statistically more likely to use the welfare system more easily during their lives. The welfare system is a white innovation, so in essence, other races have to lean on to whites to stay wealthy and prosperous. Could this leaning motion be a biological reason why other races tend to trust whites more than whites trust them? This is just me going off the top of my head, but if nothing else, it's an interesting hypothesis, and maybe a subject for future research, since this subject is a particular interest of mine. Putnam's study shows clearly the distrust between races in highly diverse areas, but still, this man has decided to use 6 whole years to undermine and underplay his own findings, which makes this whole project look kind of sad and pathetic. Reading the study further down, he has some longer than needed chapters, where he tries to explain how we could possibly turn these numbers around. What he didn't stop to consider though, is that while these arguments could be taken in the context and used as a tool to speak for the unification of different races, these same arguments, if used in another context, can be used to represent the very opposite. Here's an example, from a chapter called Becoming Comfortable with Diversity. Social psychologists and sociologists have taught us that people find it easier to trust one another and cooperate when the social distance between them is less. 38 When social distance is small, there is a feeling of common identity, closeness, and shared experiences. But when social distance is great, people perceive and treat the other as belonging to a different category. Alba and Ney 2003, 32. Social distance depends in turn on social identity, our sense of who we are. Identity itself is socially constructed and can be socially deconstructed and reconstructed. So, when is the social distance among populations less, exactly? It's less, whenever the diversity is less, and every time you try to force population, who don't trust each other, to live together, of course there will be more social distance between them. What's even more striking about this, is how he treats the term identity. Your identity is whatever you wish to link yourself into. You can change some things, and some things you cannot, and the color of your skin and your ethnic heritage is, fortunately to me, unfortunately to you, something that you simply cannot change, no matter how much you'd wish to be a victimized minority. What this obviously implies is, that some of our identities are valid, and some are not, and you mustn't categorize yourself to a group that is demonized by the public, aka the whites. What if blacks wished to identify as blacks, and embrace that identity? Would it be a problem? For me, obviously not. A world where everyone can be equally proud about their ethnic heritage, their roots, is something that I'm very much looking forward to. Biologically speaking, whites are more similar to each other than to other races, so is it wrong to wish to identify as white, and to want to live among people who are more similar to yourself? So what, if our trust to other races is low, if we got a chance to pursue our destinies separate from other races? How is that wish something that'd need to be deconstructed? This chapter of his research shows exactly the opposite than the title of the chapter promises. This is just more reasons to avoid living in a diverse society. Let's get back to Ms. Daisy Grewal for a minute. Daisy's point about diversity within whites versus other races proves that if this lady has ever visited Europe, she has gone through it completely blindfolded. European countries differ from each other like the night differs from the day. There's so many cultures and customs that I feel like the time of one human's lifespan isn't enough to absorb it all. There's different food, different languages, different customs, unique art, unique literature, unique architecture, and most importantly, unique populations. We're not one big grey mass. We, as Europeans, are diverse and beautiful as is, and bringing in millions of blacks from the third world isn't going to make us more diverse. It's going to make our crime rates increase, it's going to cause instability, more substance abuse, child abuse, infant mortality, and literally everything bad you can think of. Europe is at the brink of its destruction, and we're the only ones who can or are willing to stand up for it. Let's go the extra mile. Let's preserve Europe's unique diversity. Let's make Europe great again. As always, thank you so much for reading, and once again, stay infidel. Finish infidel.